Former President Donald Trump was indicted today for trying to overturn his loss to Joe Biden.
They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats.
Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within.
It is deeply troubling and incredibly dangerous that Donald Trump would invoke Adolf Hitler.
The work of making this world resemble one that you would prefer to live in is a lunch pail job.
Hi, and welcome to the Keystone Reckoning Podcast. I am Jesse White. We're going to jump right into it. We have a special guest with us today, Pat Dennis, with American Bridge 21st Century. And we are here to talk about the perpetual doom scroll that we are in between now and Election Day. So thank you for joining me, Pat.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So probably would be useful right up front to tell everybody what American Bridge is, kind of where you came from as an organization and kind of an overview of what you're looking to do and have been doing here in Pennsylvania and everywhere else.
Yeah, for sure. So American Bridge is a super PAC. We've been around since 2011. Probably our bread and butter and what we're most famous for is doing opposition research against Republicans. So we dig up the dirt, but also just like, the votes, the terrible things they've done in their careers, and make sure to get that publicized every election. But then starting in 2020, we also do paid media spending. In 2020, we were the largest outside spender in support of Biden in Pennsylvania. We spent about $32 million on ads in Pennsylvania, and I'm happy to get more into that and what those look like and what we're doing there. So that's another big part of it. So it's the ads and it's the Oppo research.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you're doing both because, I have this PAC and being former elected, like one of the things I thought about with it was, what's the thing that I wouldn't want people to, like, what would be the thing that would drive me crazy, right? And I was like, the Oppo research, because even you see a lot of candidates, when they're running, they don't really know, they don't do a very good job, I think, of explaining why the incumbent or whoever doesn't deserve their vote. Mm-hmm. And because so much of it is lost in the weeds. And I think the ability to kind of pick out those few things and find a way to message them effectively is really a smart move, because it's a way to kind of sprinkle some of that policy vegetables in with the things that people want to eat. So how did you kind of come onto that formula and like kind of what was the point where you knew it was going to work?
Yeah. So I personally have done Oppo research for my entire career. I started working for campaigns, but I've been with American Bridge now for more than 10 years, really focused on that strategy. And it's funny because in the post-Trump era, a lot of people decided to start to think that Oppo doesn't matter anymore because we know all these terrible things about Trump and he still got elected in one election, which is just not true. Like, voters really care about candidates. They really care about the specifics. Pennsylvania in particular, you've had some real doozies running for governor, for example, but also just like a real problem with the Republican Party there finding candidates who are from the state.
I'm going to say people that actually live here. I mean, to be fair, it's a small state. It's hard to find a place. No, you're right. The optics of who they pick are just absolute.
It's incredible, but it goes to show, somebody like McCormick, it's an incredibly important part of the case against him. Things that are traditionally Oppo research, but where he lives, where he was paid taxes, the things that he's done in his business career, which the specifics are just terrible. Somebody needs to sit down and go through all that stuff and, read all of, Bridgewater Capital's 10K reports. And, it's a lot of work, but really it's what democracy is about. It's about understanding your candidates, understanding not just what they say, but what they actually have done and what they do and how that shows what they value. So that's really what we try to foster here. And, it's a lot of reading. It's a lot of documents. It's a lot of watching videos of absolutely disgusting people at say things that are terrible.
Pandering to their base, right? That's what I love is the idea of being able to kind of, it's like the inverse of meeting voters where they are. It's kind of meeting candidates where they are. Mm. And, and especially on the Republican side and the way they play to their base, especially a guy like a McCormick, right? He's smart enough to know what to say he's cognizant of the room he's in, and he knows what to say, and you can't let him get away with that. And
yeah, well, he's hired somebody to give him the memo right before he gets on stage. I don't know if you get him.
Well,
I don't know if you get him. Yeah,
I don't know. It's in terms of his hiring. If his social media person still has a job after like the other, I'm from Pittsburgh originally. I'm out here in Harrisburg now, but I just had to laugh so hard about that. You know, he's like, oh, I'm out here for the Steelers. He's in the Eagles game, and you know, it was funny as someone who does political social media. I was like, I get what they were doing. They were like, oh, and good luck to the Steelers.
Yeah.
Just so sloppy.
When you have a pre-existing narrative that you're not from the state, you can't make it look like you don't know where the Eagles play. And I can't believe they didn't delete that. I mean, maybe they did after I got to it, but it was up for at least 24 hours.
It was. And the other one, I always love when the litmus test of going to Philly for a cheesesteak, and it always goes south for Republicans. And I think it was McCormick's group this time out where they got some like Republican operative and who was like said it was for like a faith-based thing. Like basically they got into the cheesesteak place under false pretenses and it all went south.
They said it was autism awareness.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah. And then, so they do this event and the headline coming out of it is the owner of the business being like, I can't believe these guys tricked me. Yeah. Like just utterly stepping on themselves. Yeah.
And it is, you know, I had a really enjoyed like when JD Vance did the thing at Primanti Brothers. You know, we I've spent more money and time and eaten more Primanti sandwiches than I could think of. And I was just like, but it's funny because the thing that I noticed was a lot of that is performative in that, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, like traditional political communication is about winning over votes, right? Winning or building a narrative perception. But a lot of this, what I've seen, especially in this cycle, is it's more about fueling the outrage machine. And the Primanti thing was a great example because it felt like I'm watching all these crazy videos and I know a lot of people that were in them and I'm like, oh, these are a bunch of Muppets. Like, this is ridiculous. And it felt like they knew they did it poorly on purpose because they wanted the outrage. So then they could go back to, well, Kamala Harris bust people in, which wasn't what happened, but they wanted that. It was more about like fueling the rage machine.
This is a fundamental problem, I think, where they have a hermetically sealed media environment, which is what they watch. It's what their core voters watch, but it's not what any swing voter watches. And it leads them to make these weird decisions that, feeding the outrage machine will bite you. One of the most important political attacks of all time, I think we can say at this point, to the extent that it's stuck in the everyday voter's brain, is JD Vance talking about childless cat ladies, right? That has people who don't care about politics at all. That is the one thing they know about JD Vance. And why was he saying that? Because he was going on right-wing media where that's just like a normal thing to say because those folks make money by selling ads because people listen to it and they're mad and they're super engaged with it. That has nothing to do with winning elections. That's everything to do with a media business that mostly just scams its own listeners. And you see it just backfiring on the Republican Party constantly because they have to pander to these outrage mongers just to get to a primary.
Are you ready to wear your values? At True Blue Gear, we create bold pro-democracy apparel that makes a statement. From anti-Trump designs to gear supporting voting rights, climate action, and reproductive freedom, our products speak loud and clear. And because 2024 matters, we're giving listeners of the Keystone Reckoning Podcast an exclusive 20% discount. Just use code KEYSTONE at checkout. Head over to truebluegear.com today. Stand up, stand out, and let your style show your support for a better future. True Blue Gear. Gear up. Stand out. Vote blue.
It's so funny you mentioned that. I was just talking to a friend of mine right before we got on here that worked in state government with me, and we were going back and kind of doing like a reverse timeline of how did we get here, right? And to me, the inflection point was 2010. Because, the Tea Party comes on and you start, at first they weren't taken seriously, but you saw the seeds of like going into a Bob Casey town hall meeting about Obamacare and, disrupting it. And you start to see these things. But the other piece of that then comes into the redistricting parts, especially Pennsylvania, because we were talking about how we used to actually do bipartisan things. We used to have like block parties or in the budget. And part of it is the rise of cell phones, camera phones, right? But the other part of it was after redistricting, so many moderate or reasonable Republicans lost primaries. And I think that if you got the Republican leaders from back then drunk and asked them, did you go too far with the redistricting? I think they would tell you yes, because they created a monster and they created so many deep red districts because they thought that would let them keep a majority, and it largely has. But it fundamentally made their party ungovernable because all of the moderates are gone, because it doesn't matter about offending the Democrats anymore because they could never win. Where have you seen that kind of evolution?
I mean, I've seen that, and it's funny. I never know if I should attribute it to 2010 or it's just like that was my second cycle in politics and everything.
No, it was it was my second. I got elected in 2006, and 2010 is they came after me, and they came after everybody, and so many of my colleagues in Western PA lost, and I managed to beat it by kind of going against the grain and doing some of the things you're talking about, and we actually had like operatives at events and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was a total sea change.
Yeah, for sure. And, these folks, I remember being out there in 2009, 2010, and like my first jobs as an oppo researcher was I was a tracker. I would go to the opposing candidates events and I would talk to all these Tea Party people. And this is really where you see the politics of like confrontation that's not done to like because you want to confront them, but it's done for the cameras. Like, these folks, they all had their own cameras there. Back then, they weren't even cell phones. They were flip cameras. And they were doing these, this confrontation. But those folks were legitimate extremists, like serious extremists. And in a lot of these districts, they became, the kingmakers because they ran the local Tea Party group. If you wanted to do small dollar fundraising, like the path went through them, and it has backfired extraordinarily. And, people will say, oh, but Pat, like, Trump has been remarkably successful capitalizing off this, but he hasn't. He won one election and then he lost 2018, he lost 2020, he lost 2022. And I think it's just done incredible damage to the Republican Party. Now, it's also done incredible damage to America. So that's not good.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, boy, there's not going to be a Republican Party left after Trump. Or you're like, but is there going to be a country after Trump? Like, is it going to matter?
Yeah.
And the fact that we're having those conversations now, like, seriously, is alarming. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that they you want to talk about selling your soul to the devil, right? Because you're right. What happened was then, and Republicans have always been better at this at the state level, I think, and they're very good at building a bench. There's not as much of a wait your turn mentality, right? They're like, oh yeah, come on in. And so they bring these people into local government positions or whatever. And I think a lot of it is they did in their own party what you're seeing now, which is it just becomes a war of attrition. We're going to make you so miserable and we're going to be so in your face about everything that you're just going to walk away.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting bringing this back to Pennsylvania, like Scott Perry, right? Like there's somebody who like really went off the right wing deep end, full MAGA, full like January 6th, like full, extraordinarily extreme on abortion. And now you see that district is like,
I live in it. I'm sitting in it right now. I live in Cumberland County. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, I live in P10.
And, you see the vulnerabilities from what they've done. Like the extremism is just really, really harm things. Oh, you tell me, you're there. How
it's
on the ground?
It's really interesting in that, and I knew Scott, I served with Scott in the state house, and I watched him go to Congress, and you're right, he was never this bad, right? He just, I always have a theory that like usually the higher up the ladder you go, you become almost like a caricature of who you are, right? But like, he just went all in. But the fascinating thing to me is that's not part of the narrative around here. Right. So when you have these figures that are like national figures and you're like, how does Marjorie Taylor Greene get elected in her district? Or how's Lauren Boebert moves to another district? But like how do these people get elected? Part of it is they had a veterans dinner for us, or there's always that constituent part of it. But I think the nationalized issues don't often find their way onto the ground. And I think that what I see in the messaging, and you're a messaging guy, is they almost use it in their favor, right? Like they're all coming after me. They're coming after us. So I'm going to run in and slam the door shut on them. And thank God we made it. Right. Yeah. That's kind of the vibe I get, because you don't like, I was at local, we went our kids to a local Halloween parade last week. And, Perry was actually, when he was doing his debate, so he wasn't there, but he usually is. But they had a truck or whatever for him. And you would think that if you took a Scott Perry truck down a street at a parade, like half the people at least would be throwing the candy back, right? And tell them to go F off. And you didn't really see that. And you don't hear the vitriol, or you don't hear people talking in a casual way about it. And I do think it's done a lot for party building out here. Absolutely. But
I mean, what about the Life of Conception Act stuff? Like, this is a guy who would vote for essentially a national abortion ban.
Well, it's really interesting because I moved from Washington County, which was a blue collar, blue area that then immediately a Democrat can kind of a dog catcher there.
Yeah.
To Cumberland County, and right as we moved here 5 years ago, it was that week there was an article that it had reached the point where D's and I's combined to outnumber Republicans for the first time ever, right? So it's starting to trend. But I was working with Progressive Turnout Project out here in 2020. I ran their central PA operation, and it was not hard to see. There's that thing where, again, there's a lot of pressure put out there. The Democrats believe they're alone, right? You knock on a door and they say, well, I'm a Democrat, but nobody else on the street is. And you're like, well, actually, 4 of your neighbors are. And they're like, no, this is all Republican around here. So it forces everybody to be kind of insular. Mm-hmm. And that is a huge impediment to party building and to building a narrative, right? It's kind of keeping everybody isolated because they think they're the only ones. And I think I've really seen that play out here. And it does it takes strong local party building. It takes good candidates, and it takes a lot to kind of get to that point. And I think Perry has really been a beneficiary of that. I think publicly people aren't saying much, but privately they are.
So when we do focus groups in Pennsylvania, it's pretty normal. We'll have a swing voter focus group, but right leaning and folks who voted for Trump. And it is very normal for us to see folks in those groups basically be reading each other. But then if you get them one-on-one, they're like, look, I am a Republican. I believe in this stuff, but my daughter, if she got pregnant, it's just too serious. I can't. And it's well, why didn't you say that to everybody? And they're like, well, I couldn't say it. So I wonder if there's really a quiet, and this is kind of what we saw in 2022, just a quiet majority there that's really going to drop the hammer on these people.
That is literally the argument I was just making to my friend a little while ago. And I agree 100% because I actually just done a podcast on this that, normally we're yard signs don't vote. Right? Who cares? And especially when you work on a campaign, yard signs are the bane of your existence, right?
Yeah.
But to me, and this, yard signs in public areas don't matter. Yard signs in yards at least mean something. And this is one of those times I've seen it play out in my street where it's and my wife and I have had this conversation, do we put a yard sign out because do you want to raise the ire of people? And it's but the problem is the crazy Trumpers are so in your face that if they don't see that other people are supporting the other side, it goes back to, you said, they're so insular that they're well, everybody must agree with me. So if the election doesn't go our way, then it must have been rigged, and let's go burn the Capitol down. Right. Yeah. So it actually does it. There's that social psychology to it that I think a lot of people don't get because one side is a political party and the other side's a cult. Right. Yeah. And you're playing different games and you don't want to deal with the cultist next door. Sometimes you don't want to know that the person next door is in a cult. Makes life easier. Because now I'm at the point where if you're a Trump supporter and you're not either a billionaire or a white supremacist, not that they're mutually exclusive, I don't know who you are, right? I don't, and maybe I don't want to know you. And I never thought I'd say that, but I just can't. But it's so interesting. So the focus groups are kind of bearing that out then.
Yeah. And look, we've been on the same journey. I've always been anti-yard sign, and we've been on the same journey. I put one out for the first time this year because, I think they matter, and I think they're an important counterweight to internet conversations, anything from, Facebook is ground zero for this, neighborhood listservs, people are just meaner to each other on the internet, and they're polarized, and these conversations break down. But if your neighbor down the street who you like because you borrowed his lawnmower has a lawn sign up, that is a real foot in the door for communicating.
And I think especially now, especially with the national stuff, because it's a value statement. Right? It's I care enough about this, or I have enough. To me as a candidate, when I would knock on a door, having them say they'd vote for me is great. Having them say, having just met me, right? Like, give me a yard sign. That means I really closed the deal. Mm-hmm. They're giving you that personal endorsement that matters immensely. And yeah, I think that's part of the tactic, right? Intimidation, keep everybody insular. So you can't build that sense of community, which can then help, kind of drive participation. But I agree that I think the silent majority thing now more than ever is, I think you're going to see it in this election.
Yeah, and this actually drives a lot of our advertising strategy, right? So, like, a lot of people assume that we're going to be up with ads that are like, oh, like big bad, like voice, like Donald Trump is the worst person you've ever seen. But like what we found, honestly, is like we recruit people from inside the media markets where we're going to be advertising, like real people on the ground, Pennsylvania. We also do Michigan and Wisconsin. And we don't script anything. We just sit down, like we'll literally go to their house, talk about like, hey, what issues are important to you? Like, you voted for Trump. How did he disappoint you? Like, what are you worried about? And we sit down and we just film them in their own words. And that's what we put on TV. It's just everyday people looking directly at the camera, talking about, I'm worried that my daughter won't be able to get an abortion if she needs one. We have a nurse named Lori who is up in Pennsylvania. And, she just talks about what she's seen her patients have to deal with since Roe fell down. And that has been, we find, just extremely, extremely effective, especially with women. But really outside of like the most extreme Trump partisans, like, those messages really get driven home.
Yeah. And what I'm going to do is I have some stuff from your YouTube page and everything. I'll probably just drop some audio from one of your ads in so people can actually hear that. And I'll put the link in the notes and everything so people can actually go and check it out. Because so this is what I think is super interesting, because we've actually been sitting here talking about retail politics and on the ground politics, right? But what you do is almost the exact opposite, right? They're on the ground, you're flying at 50,000 feet. And I think that in recent cycles, having consulted and worked in numerous races at various up and down the ballot, I think that Democrats have almost over-relied on field. We got to knock doors. We have to knock doors. And I think there's a segment of the party that they feel they put an outsized influence on field, and it's kind of really permeated a lot of it because knocking doors is great. But I've always said, like, above a state house race, you're never going to win by knocking on doors. It's just too big. And, that's also time. It's very time consuming, right? There are other things to do. And I've always seen, and it always seems to be getting more and more. So how do you, in crafting your message, how do you kind of see your role in kind of like the broader messaging scope of like, what are you trying to accomplish that may not be getting accomplished any other way?
Totally. So it's important to know, like, we are part of an ecosystem, right? And like, we do not do field, not because like I do, like, there's absolutely a place for field, and the Kamala campaign has that handled. I don't know. They have like 3 to 10 times as many staffers on the ground in Pennsylvania as Trump does. And it's like, they know what they need. They know what numbers they need to hit there. We're not going to add anything to that. And then there's the other super PACs. There's like Future Forward. They're really big. They're up in the huge media markets, your Pittsburghs and your Philadelphias. Where we fit into this is we've really focused in on a core demographic of swing voters. We've done this. We did it in 2020. We're doing it now. It's largely women. It is more rural, suburban, exurban, outside of like the major population centers, but folks who are, many of them haven't gone to college. These are folks where they are cross-pressured when it comes to supporting Trump. Like, a lot of them, their husband will be a big Trump supporter. They are very much on the fence. A lot of these voters voted for Trump in 2016, some of them in 2020, and they have like major doubts. Roe was the catalyst for that, but like January 6th, very much like a close second there in driving these voters away. And just the third thing is like just Trump's temperament. Like, the number one thing you hear in these focus groups is the guy's just a huge jerk, which you can't dry.
Is it a feature or a bug, though, right? We've never been able to quite figure that out. Yeah.
Well, with these voters, it's a bug. Yeah. So those are the folks we're targeting. And yeah, as I mentioned before, like the way to do it is not to put a DC like voiceover in the ad. It's to have like those actual voters explaining it to each other.
So you kind of view yourself as kind of like the tipping point, right? Like you want to be the thing that pushes them over the edge in their decision making, not over the edge, the thing that helps them make that final determination.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where like a lot of other spenders, they have to spend a lot of their time and money getting out the base, right? And that is important. We are not focused on the base. We are focused on swing voters, on folks who could go either way, folks who maybe we won in the past, but they aren't sure they want to stay with Democrats. So as I like to say, we make our lives as hard as possible. We like don't do studio ads. We do ads with real people, which is just, very effective, but logistically very hard. And we target some of the hardest voters to swing. But it's important. That's what we got to do.
Yeah, I've always been a targeting guy, and even back before we had all the tech tools to make it easier.
Yeah, it's
just so important because you have such little time to actually communicate with somebody, and if you're not talking to them about what they want to hear, but the thing they care about, it's wasted energy. Mm-hmm. And especially on the Democratic side, because we're not monolithic, and even within the same house, and that's why like things like geofencing and things like that they're amazing tools. I could literally talk to 5 different family members about 5 different issues, and they're all sitting around their tablets. Right? It's insane.
Yeah.
But knowing how to do that and how to be effective with it is, and it sounds like you use. I'm curious a little bit, without giving up your secret sauce. Like what does that process look like in terms of like figuring out the who's and when's and where's, and how does that all kind of come together?
Yeah, so we work with some real smart data firms who sort of have, the entire voter file that's, mixed together with all kinds of different demographic data. But really the core of it is, I mentioned the focus groups. It's like actually talking to people who fit into the various demographic profiles, really getting a feel for them as individuals. We do our own polling. We do a lot of, one of the things that we really focus on is what we call like media consumption studies, which is like, it's kind of naive to assume that people are just going to be watching like the nightly news on broadcast. Like, it's like it's 1982. So we spend a lot of time, like how much time do you spend on Facebook? How much time do you spend consuming TikTok? How much time do you spend reading paper newspaper? It's very little. How much time do you spend, reading different online publications, watching television news, everything conceivable. And we try to get a real, a lot of these folks, most of our targets are not political junkies at all, but they spend a lot of time listening to, true crime podcasts, things like that. So we really try to get a feel for how they consume the media so that we're not just like dumping our money into broadcast ads that are, that nobody's watching, and making sure we can, meet them where they are, meet them, the places where they're actually going to hear these messages.
Yeah, I could tell you, at least you guys have the funding to do the different things. I can't tell you what a nightmare it has become to try to do a media buy in a campaign where you have no money. Yeah. It's almost impossible because there's no good options anymore. Right? It's just, like to do that, I can understand that process, but then being able to carry it out in terms of not only the ability to buy the ad time, but to produce enough creative to meet all of it.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, trying to get candidates and organizations to understand that is really hard. And it's, yeah. So it's to have the ability to, and the resources to actually kind of see that process through from beginning to end is really, really effective.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a luxury. I've worked on much smaller campaigns where we don't have that kind of thing. I was around in some cases before these tools existed. But this is also kind of why we do the Oppo as well, because like if something we really believe in here is like you can buy as much media as you want, but like it's not going to, generally speaking, like beat a person opening up a trusted media source and seeing some key piece of information. So like, Dave McCormick screwing up the teachers' pensions in Pennsylvania, like that's something that was like on local TV, in local newspapers all over the state. And like that, that kind of earned media stuff is also something we're really focused on.
Yeah, I think, a really good example of that, because I'm a big believer. One of the old timers that I first dealt with, he told me, define yourself and define your opponent. Right, those are the most important two things you can do.
Amazing.
And it's amazing. Right. It's candidates just don't do that as much, and I think a lot of that is kind of what we're talking about here. Those little things. Like, for example, Dave McCormick not knowing he was at not knowing he was in Eagles game except for Steelers game. For a lot of people, that was kind of all they need to know. But that wouldn't have worked had the narrative not been made and the groundwork hadn't been laid that he doesn't live here. If you don't have that first piece of information, the second piece doesn't matter.
Yeah, and it all got a boost from the fact that it worked on Dr. Oz last time.
Well, that was it. That was my whole point. That this is a place
it builds on itself. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I remember when Fetterman did they just trolled him so hard with the billboard or the flyover with, and they got Snooki to do like a cameo or whatever. It was like, come back to New Jersey. Yeah. And it was funny because I was running a campaign at the time. So I was with a lot of political people in Lancaster County, and it was very mixed reviews about how that was playing. And you could kind of see who got it and who didn't, because it was like, they're going to get to defining who Fetterman is, but they've got to define who Oz is first. And it played out beautifully. And what's your opinion? Do the Republicans do this, or do they do it well? Or, what's the comparison?
It depends. Like, you can definitely find examples of them doing a good job still. The Republicans over the past 5 years have purged a lot of their actual talent. Some of their best folks on this have actually since gone to the private sector, or some of them even became Democrats. Somebody like Tim Miller. But yes, they're still capable of doing it, and they have a slightly easier job in the sense that they have a bought and paid for media ecosystem where one person without media standards can report it. Fox News will pick it up and say so-and-so alleges, and then it ends up in the mail piece. And then, and then somebody asks about it in debate because it's out there, even though it's they have their own ways of doing it, which are a little bit more underhanded. But, in a lot of ways, they're swimming against the tide in the sense that there's just this huge, branding problem they have named Donald Trump, which in a lot of places that they used to win has become just anathema. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I always think that I look at Project Veritas and that kind of garbage, and if you read the backstories of those and how insane, when it all comes tumbling down, it's always insane. But it feels to me like I'm looking at what you do. And even when you're not even gotcha stuff. To me, it's never considered gotcha or dirty politics. I think that Democrats a lot of times fall into this. Well, we can't do, just because they do it, we shouldn't do it. When they go low, we go high stuff, which I'm real glad that we've kind of moved away from that. When the Obamas were kind of F that, we're done with that. I was thank God.
Yeah. We go in a variety of different directions.
Right. Hey, you go where the tide takes you sometimes.
Yeah.
But this idea of it's dirty to do this kind of stuff. And it's look, especially if it's an elected official who's already in there, talking about their record and the things they say, with a lot of what you do is kind of bringing the details to light of things about policy and what's really being said, which I think a lot of times Democrats traditionally view that, they kind of frown on that. And they're like, oh, that's gotcha politics. We need to be better than that.
Yeah.
What would you say to those people?
Yeah.
I know what I'd say to them, but I'd like to know what you say.
Would you prefer a world where you just don't know that Dave McCormick funded military weapons manufacturers in China, right? It's good. It's important to know that stuff, or the fact that he was short selling Hershey, trying to drive them out of business. These are things that matter, that drive home, to tell you something about what this person values, what they believe. And, you think back to a world where there was a gentleman's agreement where we won't talk about this stuff. It's that doesn't lead to a more informed electorate. That just leads to, elite essentially colluding with each other to keep people in the dark. So voters deserve to know, but you can't just make stuff up, right? It needs to be vetted. Virtually everything we do, we hand off, we'll do the investigation and then we'll hand it off to a legitimate journalist and say, hey, you can, you know this now, like you can verify it or you can't, but like this is information that deserves to be out there.
Right. Yeah, I always take it from the perspective of you can't govern if you don't win. And we've seen the result of that, right? Like it matters, it's I always look at it like don't break the law, don't do anything that's
very important.
Right. Well, and not only that, like there are definitely lines, right? You don't go after a candidate's family or anything. Like, there are clear lines of kind of rules of war that at least I think we abide by. But beyond that, if we're talking about like their professional things they're saying or their performance or whatever, like how is that? Isn't that kind of like the thing we should be judging them on?
Yeah. And it's such, I mean, not to criticize my fellow Democrats too much, but, it is a luxury to be able to sit around and decide not only, do I want to win, but do I want to win like while wearing a completely unsoiled, like white cape that, it just is entirely perfect. And it's like, no, like this is politics. Like people's lives are at stake here. It's like, are these kids going to get Medicaid or not?
I think you're right. And I think one of the challenges that we run into is we, as Democrats, I think we generally overanalyze things a lot more. And I look at it like this, like, I feel like Democrats a lot of times find reasons to not support a candidate and Republicans find any reason to support.
Yeah.
And
Trump's story.
Yeah, right. And so, for example, I've, my political past dealt with taking on the fracking industry to great, it was quite the adventure, that ultimately led to me losing my last election. And to me, and I got called by some reporters after the Harris-Trump debate because they knew I was, active on this issue. And they were like, well, what do you think about, what she said about fracking? I was like, I don't care. I don't care. My opinion on the issue hasn't changed.
Yeah.
But if you think that is like, I'm willing to acknowledge that if that's what you have to say, or if that's what you believe, if that's the one thing I have a problem with, I don't care. Like,
you're never going to agree with a candidate 100%. Like never. Right. It's not possible.
I've seen so many former colleagues and people, I always say, if a candidate tells you everything you want to hear, you are being lied to.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's just not possible. And I feel like we try to be a little too perfect. I think you're wearing the white cape. I think that's a good way of putting it. But it makes, from a messaging point of view, though, does it make your job harder because your audience is different?
It is lucky. Like for us on the paid media, our audience is defined largely by being not completely apolitical, but not political junkies at all. So they're a fresh group. Now, on the oppo side, a lot of the people who read this kind of reporting are, seriously into politics. And that only makes it down to the voters later in the paid media or, when, if it ends up on the candidate's Wikipedia page and they're reading up before they vote and that kind of thing. So, for us, it's pretty easy. Like we never really hear pushback. Number one, because most of the time, nobody even knows where stuff came from us. We're just providing information out there. And you're
not on the ground, right? That's, that is one of the luxuries of not being, you could do that kind of stuff and you're more worried about getting it out there because you don't have to. Yeah. You don't have to get that direct pushback from folks.
But I'm always happy to be criticized. If people want to criticize me for being too tough on the Republicans, like guilty as charged, like yeah.
Right. Well, right. It's almost it's a luxury in some ways, but it's also a responsibility in the other because you have the ability to really shape the narrative in ways that those individual door knockers can't. Yeah. But there's also a responsibility there to make sure that you're not doing anything to steer the ship the wrong way. Like you've got a bigger oar than a lot of people, and there's a responsibility with that.
That is important, especially. It's funny, actually. So we were always and still are a DC based organization. Post COVID now, like our staff is all over the place. And that has been a huge benefit. Now, like, half our comms team lives in Wisconsin. We have people in Michigan. We have people in Pennsylvania. We have people in Texas. And honestly, like having a remote staff that's on the ground and like literally like in these places really makes us more effective, I believe. There's only so much you can do from Washington, D.C.
Right. Yeah. Right. I'd be interested. So do you think just as a result of kind of your organization having a kind of a different feel, right? Different kind of, because you're not centralized. Do you think that then made its way into the way you communicated with folks that you wouldn't have had otherwise?
Yeah, I think it's definitely helped. Like, just you can't help but have a better feel for the election when you're, living in the place, seeing the same local news as everybody else. And, this, I'd love to take credit for this as like a great political strategy, but ultimately, like, we just went remote during the pandemic, and a lot of people moved out to the States where, they're from, or where they'd, worked on previous elections. And it just happened to work out really well.
That's great. So
Yeah.
I want to ask you about something you mentioned a couple of times, and it's become more of an issue, I think, in this cycle than I've ever seen before, which is the role of the media. And, we've heard the term sane washing and all these different things. And I'd love to get your opinion on it. And not only just kind of is part of the larger, are things different now and maybe why that is, but then also, you talked about working with reporters, with the media to bring these things out, and the challenges that you may be running into or not, that would allow us to believe, is the media doing their job? Are they doing it the right way?
Yeah. Well, how much time you got? And also,
we have 14 more minutes, but I think it's become a really big deal.
Yeah, it is a big deal. And my answer on this also changes depending on the time of day you catch me at, depending on how mad I am at any given reporter. I think there have been colossal world-changing failures of the media. Donald Trump is number one in a lot of ways. Like, I'm not going to relitigate the 2016 emails coverage in the New York Times, but that is the go-to example. But more so than that, there is just a general, like, he gets graded on a curve. Like, the guy, like, we had how many news cycles about mental fitness in this country, and then Donald Trump does a town hall, abruptly stops taking questions, has the sound guys start playing his favorite songs, and stands there dancing for 40 minutes. And it's like barely a blip. Like, if
not only that, the Wall Street Journal, did you see their headline for it?
No,
It said,
I don't want to.
Town hall ends in concert.
Yeah. Yeah.
What?
So I have an incredible amount of criticism that I believe needs to get out there that is deserved. And a lot of it is just like an ambient sense of Trump is graded on a different set of rules than everybody else. That said, overall, I am less of a media critic overall, because the media is not one thing. There is incredibly great, like, world-changing, like, some of the best media that's ever existed out there right now. Now, much of it is behind paywalls, and maybe 0.5% of swing voters ever see it. There's also some of the worst, most biased Sinclair stuff being beamed into people's homes for free. And that is a huge problem. So, the media is a lot of things. Overall, the individual reporters I know are generally well-meaning, they're rigorous, they're not biased, and there are obviously exceptions to that, but they are existing within this system that just has, huge problems. That said, I also think it's a real problem if Democrats spend all their time on Twitter criticizing the New York Times when the New York Times is not read by swing voters in any of these states.
Right. That's funny. I think you, and I've been on Twitter more, and I'm like, why? But then I'm like, but it's like, you kind of need to know, right?
You gotta work the reps. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, but knowing going in that, like 40% of the accounts are Russian bots, and, they're throttling accounts, like, that part of it's important. Otherwise I'd be losing my mind. But hearing what people are saying and seeing this debate, but then taking comfort knowing, like, I'll be doom scrolling until 3 a.m, but I'm like, but the good news is, like, hardly any voters are actually on here. This is such a very niche group of people.
For sure.
Like, that's what lets them finally get to sleep.
Yeah. And number one, I will say, like, I do as I say, not as I do. Like, I am on Twitter way more than I should be. But number one, I always say, like, Twitter is not a voter focus group, right? You're not learning what the voters believe on here, but you are learning the sort of soup that a lot of the media lives in. And, like, it's important to know, like, what they're seeing, what sort of fake, not real, vocal, like small groups of vocal people on Twitter is like influencing people, and being aware of that matters.
Yeah, I look at going through Twitter and that kind of stuff is like, it's like raw polling data, right?
Yeah.
It can tell you a lot if you know how to read it, and if you don't, you're going to do more harm than good.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of an inside thing if you've never tried to read polling data or crosstabs, but and so let me ask one more thing I want to get to before we're done. I'm going to save it for a minute, but I have one question before that. Is so much talk about polls. My thought is they're all within the margin of error, and we've gotten into this idea where we've let it become an average of polls, so you're seeing so much garbage put in. Is there, from your perspective, do you give any credence to polls in general? I know there's some better than others.
Yeah.
And do you think there's a method to the madness of trying to flood the field with these pro-Trump polls?
If you're a voter, don't do what I do. Don't stay on Twitter till 3 a.m. and then don't get up at 6 a.m. and check Pennsylvania polls every morning. You'll drive yourself insane. That said, that's exactly what I do. So I will say the flooding, there's a lot of things that the Trump campaign is doing right now where they are trying in advance to create a circumstance where they can say the election was stolen.
Yes.
Now, how many of these polls are directly related to that? How many of them are Republican pollsters just trying to get their name in the news? How much this is part of his strategy? How much is just helpful to them? It's hard to say, but I think there is a real incentive for Republicans to kind of, put these bull polls into the average. That said, I am also if Democratic voters are more anxious about the election, I think that helps us in terms of turnout. It doesn't help anybody, find the truth of the matter or sleep better at night. But as a practitioner, I believe that polls are extremely important. Directionally important. They help you see trends that are happening, even if the raw numbers are difficult. Difficult to really trust. You can see, opinions change. You can see different demographics move in a way that is only important if you're somebody like me who's trying to direct $50 million in spending to the right spot where it's not going to be wasted. That is not most people. Yeah.
Right. But do you think to some extent the tail wags the dog a little bit? So if they're like, oh, well, it's a 50-50 race, so Trump must not be as terrible as everybody's saying, because if half the people in the country are for him, he must not be too bad. So maybe I should be for him.
Potentially. But would I prefer a world where Trump, and, we lived in this world in 2020 to some extent, where Trump is behind 6 or 7 points when in reality the polls are inaccurate and he's only behind by 1? That is not also great either. There's advantages and disadvantages, but the fact is we live in a world where getting a representative sample for a poll is virtually impossible.
It is.
Try to get a representative sample of Trump voters. They're not answering the phones. They don't trust you. Anybody you do get in there who is a Trump voter is probably not representative of other Trump voters. It is just very difficult. And there are techniques for dealing with it, but it is, it's difficult, and it's difficult to understand the size of the error bars on this data and which parts of the data are questionable. So I'd say it's useful for professionals, and you can drive yourself crazy as a voter looking at this stuff.
So this gets me into the last thing. We've kind of gone chronologically, the ramp up. We're at the election. Let's talk about the end game here, and the end game of what, I guess, is to be determined.
Yeah.
But you touched on it, and there was a Rolling Stone piece yesterday that kind of said the out loud part even louder about, Trump's plan. They talked to 4 attorneys in his orbit, and the plan is to immediately declare a victory on election night.
Yep.
And the pieces that are coming into place, you see in Virginia where they waited to purge the voter rolls, so they knew it would be scaled back, so then they could say, they could be aggrieved, right? Yep. They kept 90,000 people. They wouldn't let us take these illegals and whatever's off the rolls. Pennsylvania pre-canvassing. Governor Shapiro says we're not going to have these done on election night because the Republicans they killed the bill that was sitting in the Senate right now that would allow for 7-day pre-canvassing. And then, they immediately, and this is where Twitter can be useful because you see where the reactionaries are going, is, well, that's it right there. because it sounds like Trump's idea, they do the same thing in Wisconsin. The idea is they're playing to the lowest common denominator. I was winning when the polls closed.
Yep.
And I think this is where the polling comes into play. I think, and this is just, I have no science to back this up. My gut is if votes were to be counted right now and a winner was determined on who won, got the most votes, which I know is a novel concept, but I think she wins by 2.5 to 3 points in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
I really
lines up
that.
with what I think.
And if that happens, but a bulk of those votes are mail-in voters, which are obviously disproportionately Democratic, and they're going to come in later, and they're going to try to add 1 and 1 and get 30. They're going to say, the polls were neck and neck, and then all of a sudden, all these other votes came in. Therefore, those are illegitimate votes. The polls showed otherwise because people don't realize that polls aren't the most accurate thing in the world. And that's going to be their move to, and there are these extremists like in the Michael Flynn world the plan is very simple. And the Rolling Stone article laid it out. The plan is to get the state legislatures to award the electoral votes on their own. I mean, it's insane, but at this point, we're at the limits to insane.
Yep.
I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of generally where I think November 5th is when this starts, not when it ends.
Mm.
Kind of like where you think we're going. And maybe more importantly, not that your opinion doesn't matter, but in talking to folks, how aware are people in these focus groups of where we're at and how dangerous of a place we're at? Like, do people get it or not?
There's a wide mix in how much the average voter gets it. Many of them do not, but a lot, like more than many people would expect, saw January 6th for exactly what it was and were profoundly disturbed by it. And those people, are disproportionately voters in this country. Like people who care about democracy are also people who go out to vote. So what they're trying to do, in my mind, you can see the way they're lining this up. They're lining up rhetoric and they're lining up an argument they can make to the public. They're not lining up really a way to like win court cases on the merits, right? That is not the strategy they're doing. What they're trying to do is buy PR cover for the state legislators, for, maybe in certain places, secretaries of state, although they got wiped out in a lot of these secretary of state races, to do things that ultimately, like in a normal environment, would not be accepted. Now, we saw this in 2020 and the rule of law helped. In some cases, barely. And there is the real potential, once again, if they're doing this essentially PR strategy, that they will once again drive people to targeted violence against.
Right. So one of the guys that I heard this, Ivan Raikin, I just stumbled in this video of him the other night giving a speech in Pennsylvania in which he laid it all out. And he said, look, when the election's stolen, right? Foregone conclusion.
Yeah.
When the election's stolen, December 1st is a day that matters because that's when the new legislature takes effect in Pennsylvania, which isn't exactly true, but whatever.
Yep.
And he said, we will have to go to the state capitol and convince them. And then he elaborated and he said, we need to make those spineless Republican senators do the right thing.
Yeah.
And I was like they're basically making it clear, like they don't even care about what the Democrats are going to do. Their whole thing is putting the pressure on the Republicans.
Yep.
And I think that we are all so exhausted, and voters, obviously not people like you and me, but voters as well. We just want it all to be over.
Yep.
And I think that what I really worry about is that when they think it's over, it's not going to be over because the other side won't let it be. And that's when we're going to have to really kind of dig in our heels. And this is where I think the media really is good. How the media covers this.
Yeah.
What happens next?
You can't both sides it. Like,
right.
This is about hearts and minds. That's where they're fighting it, at least.
Exactly. And right. I was looking at it like this. To me, the thing that broke Trump's back in 2020 was when Fox News called Arizona.
Yeah.
That was it, right? That was
the way that it sails.
Yeah. And you're like, well, okay. Like, and my question is, I almost feel like I have to watch Fox on election night this year. Right. Because that's the barometer for me. Right. I mean, do you think the media is going to kind of step up and meet the moment, or is that a big concern?
It's a big concern. It's interesting. You look at a place like Fox, you look at a place like Newsmax, which ultimately saw massive legal repercussions from the way they covered the election. I think to some extent, like, I do not want to vouch here for like the integrity of the people at Fox News, but they do care about dollars, and I think they are chastised by the potential of losing another $1 billion to a court settlement that goes the wrong way.
It'll be fascinating with Kamala Harris agreeing to do an interview on Fox.
Yeah,
because I really feel like Trump anything less than them getting on there and like calling her every horrible name in the book, like slurs, like, you know what I mean? Like he's got to want to go all the way. Anything short of that is going to be seen as betrayal.
Yeah,
and it's going to be like I said the best fundraiser the Democrats could ever, or the Republicans could ever have, if they charge Democrats to watch a live stream of Trump watching that interview, they'd make $1 billion because I'd
close the money gap right there.
Right. And so it is fascinating. Even in recent interviews, it does feel like there's a higher level of awareness of like, it's almost like this, like, Trump, we're trying to help you, but he doesn't even get that. No. And like, you've taken it so far, like, well, we can't go along with this. But like, I wonder, for example, like if Trump, at some point, do they stop giving him the amplifier of a voice, right? Like at some point, do you stop, and I'm not talking about now, but after the election, if he's just going to get up there and incite violence, at what point does the media say, maybe we shouldn't be carrying this to the country?
So he's back on Twitter. He still has Truth Social. So to some extent, he will have a megaphone. Now, it is difficult to imagine like Fox News cutting him off. But
no, right.
It was difficult to imagine Fox News cutting off Tucker Carlson, and they did. Which I don't pretend to understand what led to that, but like, look, it's possible it could happen again. I am not counting on it by any stretch.
Well, and I'm thinking more along the lines of like major networks, right?
Yeah.
At some point, do they, or run a scroll saying, I think that's going to really, you said, you can't both sides of this because the second you do that, you've really kind of lost, right? And we've learned, you and I'm assuming I know I was around long enough to see what happened in 2000, where all it took was that little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that made me think about 2000 was watching Karl Rove today doing an interview in which he called the January 6 people a bunch of son of bitches who need to be locked up. And I'm like, that's how far we've come, right? Like, I'm like, yeah, you go, Karl Rove. Like, what? Where are we at right now?
Yeah.
So one last question on this. I know we have to go here in a minute, but knowing that you don't want to get people riled up, but it seems to me the difference is that previously, it would always be other people like were getting super worried, and like people like you and I, like you said, practitioners, we were the ones that would like calm everybody down, right? Mm-hmm. Feels like in this election, it's almost the inverse.
Yeah.
Where we're like, we've really gone in some weird places. We got to be careful.
Yep.
Knowing that, and knowing that we're going to be one way or another, this is not going to be easy. Like no matter what, it may not be the end of the world, but like, it's not going to be easy. Do you envision, and do you think there's a place for like your organization to then continue the messaging beyond election?
Yes, 100%.
Can you talk about that at all?
Yes, and it is important. That's going to be an all hands on deck thing. Like, so the most important thing we did is like 2022, we pulled out all the stops for the first time and made sure that, all these states, Arizona, Wisconsin, it's all down the line, had Democratic secretaries of state win to be overseeing these elections in the first place. So that's sort of when it started. But yeah, after election
I work with some of those groups. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. After election day, it's like Trump is playing this as an earned media, hearts and minds, like we're going to win the mandate of the people and we'll backfill the law with whatever we can get Republican legislators to do. Like that is a real problem. That's going to need to be fought out every day. Like we need to be making sure that like people understand that he's lying, that they're disenfranchising millions of voters, and there will we will not have the majority of the Republican establishment backing us on this, but there will be some of them who will stand up to Trump. Like I don't want to say nice things about Brian Kemp. He did it in 2020. Yeah. There will be others like that. We need to bring those people into the fold, make sure that we can stand up for democracy when it's like under its greatest attack.
Right. I don't think there'll ever be a better test than all, for, kind of really see who's who. Every time about being a patriot, right? For these Republicans, and they're up. I think they're up late at night for different reasons than we are.
Yeah.
because they know there's a reckoning coming for them, right? Like, the uprising is coming from inside the house, and you can skate along for a long time, but there's a point where the rubber is going to meet the road. And I think you and I are kind of feeling the same way, that point is coming.
Yep. And those folks are afraid of the Trump base. Like you saw during the Trump administration, you would have on background Republican legislators saying, I would stand up to him, but I worry for my family. Like that was a real quote that like came out consistently.
We saw that here in Pennsylvania. When Brian Cutler, he sat in front of me for like 4 years on the House floor. We were both rank and file, and he's a speaker, and he's a very conservative Republican, but he's like a good human being.
Yeah.
You get to know these people, and you're like, okay, this is not he's a good guy. At the end of the day, and he refused, as we've learned, to go along with it, and it wasn't widely reported, but there were people showing up outside his house, and he has young kids, and as a parent, I don't know how anybody could be. I couldn't do that job today. I'd be terrified to do it the right way.
Yeah.
Right. To be an advocate for the things you believe in. It's only been 10 years and it's such a different world. It's unbelievable. But no, I think you nailed it on the head, and it's encouraging for me to know that the people that are have such an important role in shaping the narrative, especially talking to the people that when, we're going to be going into some choppy waters here, and they may not know what to think because it's going to be hitting them all at once from all angles, and it's going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And to help provide some clarity in a way, like I almost feel like the water's going to be rising and everybody's going to be, finding a way to maybe like quietly slip a lifeline. Here's a life vest. I'm going to talk to you in a way that I know you're going to understand.
Yep.
And help that, that messaging, which will then have a cumulative impact. I think that's so incredibly important. And the fact that people like you and your organization are planning for that and are cognizant of it, it will actually let me maybe get to bed a little early tonight. So I thank you for that.
Good. I'm hoping I'll be able to take a vacation by January, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, or maybe you'll be taking a forced one somewhere, right?
Exactly.
Excellent. Well, we catch you a little bit longer, but I thank you so much. Is there anything you want to send anybody to learn more or donate or do whatever? Please, it's all yours.
American Bridge on Twitter, AmericanBridgePack.org. I'm Pat Dennis on Twitter, but if we're doing our jobs, you'll see our work without having to do anything. It'll come to you.
That's awesome. Pat, thank you so much for everything. I'll put links to everything in the notes. This has been the Keystone Reckoning Podcast. I'm Jesse White. Keep it up. We're almost there, and we just got to keep fighting. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, man.
Well, that's it then. We've saved people the trouble of voting. What's next?
Our point is that it's...
I understood the point. When I ask what's next, it means I'm ready to move on to other things. So, what's next?
We're done.
Fantastic.